Everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started because we're on kind of a tight schedule. So before we start with the session, I want to take a second to recognize someone who has just won our Legislative Education Staff Network Award. We give this award out once a year to a staffer who is recommended by their peers and then chosen by the LESN Steering Committee. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to recognize Mr. David Epley for all of his great and hard work.
I wonder if it seems like it's echoing out there. The tech guy's over there. Hopefully he's working on it.
I just want to recognize that some of the stuff his recommendation letters mentioned were his many years of work, his dedication to education policy, and his service to help all the people in his state of Iowa. So thank you and congratulations.
One of our favorite things to do every year is to give away that award. So he will also be recognized at the Legislative Staff Lunch as well. For those of you who will be attending, he will be recognized there too. So congratulations. Our staff network is an amazing network of legislative staff. So we are thrilled to be able to host that and thrilled that you're able to receive that award. So today we're going to start off by talking about the future of education. We wanted to do this session because we think it's really important to not only think about what our education system needs right now, what do the students in the classroom need right now, but what is the vision we want to create for the work that we want to be doing to get us to the future? What does that classroom of the future look like? I'd like you to just take a minute to really think about that. Who is at the front of the classroom? Is there anyone? Or are children participating in teaching? Is it digital? What role does AI play? What is the role of the principal? How is the building organized? Are students learning from traditional textbooks? Are they learning online? Or are they learning from their peers around the world? How are students supported? How is student learning supported? So these are the kinds of things that I've asked two of the foremost thinkers in this space to come and discuss with us today, and I have the pleasure of having them with me. Both of them are big thinkers in this space and have tremendous resources available for you to dig into that we have connected you to on our app. The first person who's going to be joining us is Vicki Phillips from the National Center on Education and the Economy. She is CEO there, but previous to that, she has been a superintendent. I guess I should start first by a teacher, first and foremost. A superintendent of a school district, a secretary of education. She's worked in nonprofits. She's also led the education work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and at the National Geographic Society. Most importantly, Vicki has been a tremendous partner to NCSL in our work that we've been doing. We've partnered with the National Center on Education and the Economy over the past decade to help legislators and staff understand what are the elements of the highest performing education systems across the world, and including here in the United States and in our school districts, and how can that help you create a vision for what education can look like in your states. So it just seems natural that we would have them come and speak at this session. So first I'm going to ask Vicki to join us. She's going to spend about 15 minutes or so giving us a talk about what her vision is, what the National Center on Education and the Economy's vision is for education of the future. And then we will be joined by our next speaker. So with this, I will welcome Vicki.
Thank you, and good morning. As you heard, I'm Vicki Phillips, and first and foremost, I'm a champion of young people and of the educators, the ed leaders, and the policymakers that support them. As you also heard Michelle say, I've had a very fortunate career. I've been a former secretary of K-12 and higher education, a district superintendent twice, most importantly, a classroom teacher, and has seen classrooms evolve over an extended period of time. You know, each day, every day, we have an incredible opportunity to work on behalf of America's young people, to boost our economy, and to strengthen our communities. And each of you are very important to seizing that moment. Your leadership is vital. You have the ability as leaders to communicate the stakes, to foment the ambition, to demonstrate what's possible in an education system that is future-ready and learner-centered. Your leadership sets the tone, shapes the conversation, and helps mobilize collective action to drive more powerful outcomes for young people. You know, well-intentioned attempts to reform education are abundant across the landscape. Many of them fail for two reasons. One, a limited belief in what's possible, and two, a shortage of common ambition. Enduring change requires shared ambition and buy-in from the hearts and minds of many. It demands that elected officials, educators, business leaders, and community leaders and other policymakers, as well as young people, move together with a unified sense of what the agenda should be, an agenda that reflects the goals, values, and needs of those being served. One thing that's really powerful is that this kind of undertaking is becoming more and more prevalent across the country. And it's because of leaders like you, leaders who are by, of, and for their communities, that are seizing this moment. Across the U.S., education policymakers are undertaking bold and ambitious bipartisan efforts to reimagine education. Your colleagues in jurisdictions just over or states over, and perhaps some of you yourself, are coalescing that collective ambition and making sure that their communities create education systems that are truly responsive to the future of learning and the future of work. It's an opportunity being taken up by legislators of all backgrounds and affiliations. Some of your colleagues that are doing that work are here in the room in places like Nevada, Pennsylvania, Montana, Michigan, and beyond. Leaders from both parties are kind of putting that oar in the water and working together. They're building that dynamic, forward-leaning system that you're going to hear us talk about this morning that will serve the social, economic, and civic needs of our community today, but also far into the future. And you know, the future demands such an education. And education is an economic engine, a critical component of national security, and a necessary ingredient for engaged communities and robust democracies. You know, I'm from here in Kentucky. I don't live here now, but I'm a product of its rolling hills and resilient spirit. I grew up in Falls of Rough, a place etched in my memory with the warmth of community and the sting of struggle. My childhood was good, but it wasn't without its hardships. And like many places in your states, our rural community didn't send many people to college. I was actually the first in my family to go. And when I went home and told my stepfather, who raised me from the time I was very small, that I wanted to go to college, he said to me, "Your values are not our values if you go to college. If you do that, don't come back." I defied him and went anyway to Western Kentucky University, about 90 miles from home, but it might as well have been 9,000. My mother was afraid she'd never see me again, and my stepfather was afraid he would. My first teaching job was here in Kentucky, and I cut my teeth helping lead the Kentucky Education Reform Act, a comprehensive set of policies that really changed the trajectory of education in this state. Our state legislature was so pivotal to that work, and in building not just the coalition to pass the act, but to actually seeing it through and staying diligent about that. Kentucky made real progress, moving from near the bottom of the nation on most metrics to kind of the upper half And while there's still a lot of work to be done, Kentucky demonstrates that that kind of ambitious, bold policy change that you can help spearhead on behalf of students and schools can have real results. NCE's work with states and districts, I have such a privilege to lead this organization now, is based on nearly 4 decades of research into the world's best and fastest improving education systems. Our recently refreshed blueprint for designing systems that work is a distillation of that research. It offers insights into the core elements of successful systems, their dynamic interconnections, and also how those disparate elements come together to drive outsized student performance. I'm going to share a little bit of that blueprint with you today, the refreshed one. It's not public yet, but it will be in just a few days, and we'll make sure that all of you get the link. The blueprint's actually organized into 4 interdependent parts, and state legislators have a critical role to play in every one of those pieces. So first, prepare young people for long life learning. Long life rather than lifelong, as a nod to the reality that we are all living longer. And our young people will need the kinds of skills and education that will help them over that extended lifetime. The blueprint's not a how-to guide or a cookie-cutter solution. It's just a driver of dialogue, a springboard to possibility, and it leaves completely to you as leaders in your states and communities to determine how to build the education systems that give young people those skills to thrive in the years and decades ahead. Systems built not just with the future in mind, but at its very strategic heart. So this starts with preparing young people, as I said, for lifelong learning. Making sure that they have those early starts that we all talk about. Enacting policies that support high-quality early learning and foster excellence all the way to graduation. Successful countries bolster that by providing pathways to life after school that are meaningful, accessible, and aligned to an evolving economy. They include career and college on-ramps from an early age so that students are invested, motivated, and persist at higher rates. And they provide ample opportunities for experienced workers to continue to upskill and reskill over the course of their lifetime because they want no dead ends to the learning journeys of individuals. So first, prepare young people for long life learning. That means thinking very differently about the role that education institutions play over the course of an individual's lifetime. Second, cultivate high-capacity, forward-thinking educators. You heard all those questions Michelle was asking earlier about how learning should happen. Successful systems know that they can only go as far as their teachers and leaders take them. They commit to that virtuous cycle of education policy that we talk about a lot, from enhancing teacher recruitment and retention to career advancement. They ensure that teachers are not just highly qualified, but they're highly supported. But equally crucially, these forward-leaning, high-performing places are now thinking and rethinking the skills that educators need, making sure that educators can provide for a future-ready education and understand what that means and the kind of curriculum and pedagogy that will take. A future that's being rapidly reshaped by AI and other technologies demands significant shifts in teaching and learning, and it demands reimagining time, space, and staffing. So second, cultivate high-capacity, forward-thinking educators. Third, join forces to ensure that young people thrive. High-performing systems prioritize education as vital for both individuals and communities to flourish. And they also recognize that learning happens everywhere, both inside and outside the school setting. They blur the lines between formal and informal schooling in a healthy way, and leaders leverage the broader community on behalf of all young people. They work to ensure that their students master those academic subjects that are all important, but also that they develop the habits of learning and well-being that will carry them into and sustain them into the future. They provide intentional support for students who are struggling with mastering those fundamental skills. They also provide a lot of options for young people to go further, faster. And they work hard to bring people and institutions together on behalf of young people. They recognize the power of working with families and working at the intersection of different sectors to address student and community needs. So join forces to ensure that young people thrive. Finally, think differently about systems leadership. Now, there's decades of research about high-performing education systems and the fact that has demonstrated that strategic leadership and thinking, from articulating a vision to continuous improvement, is all important. But given the pace of change in both education and the economy, fueled somewhat by the AI revolution, means that those fundamental skills are now the floor. They are no longer the ceiling. Policymakers and education leaders in top-performing systems help their communities revisit core assumptions about how, when, where, and by whom education is delivered. They help them revisit all those questions that Michelle was asking earlier. They help build broader and deeper coalitions anchored in a compelling vision of the future of learning and work. They hold two time frames in juxtaposition, making sure that they are creating momentum for the short term, but always keeping their eye on that longer term vision, given how rapidly the world is changing. They also make sure that they know, as we're talking about this morning, what the best-in-class systems are doing around the world and in the United States. Not as a way to be a cookie cutter again. Instead, they flex that knowledge in service of their own contexts and their own communities, thinking about what the implications mean for their settings. And at every step of the way, they are highly cognizant that the students in their states and districts will be entering a future in which how people work, the problems they need to solve, the decisions they make, and the skills they need will be ever changing. So the blueprint is focused, just like you are, on creating a dynamic, forward-leaning system of public education that serves the economic and civic needs of our communities and our country. State legislators are essential actors in this work. It's a bold undertaking, to be sure, but it's one that's already happening across the country. We are in a unique position, those of us in this room and our colleagues across the country, to learn from one another and to stand on the shoulders of those who are further down the path. Taking that emerging state of change and transforming it into large-scale results takes courageous leadership, whether you're a representative in a small community or in a large urban one. As leaders, we have to put our own voice into the effort, showing people in our communities that they are absolutely at the center of the process and helping them understand what's possible. Smart leaders aren't distracted by the latest education panacea that promises speedy results. They know that bold policy takes sustained time and investment. This is leadership that endures. It's leadership that has an impact and is intentional. It's the kind of leadership that can accomplish remarkable things, not in decades and generations, but across the lifetime of individual students. You have the opportunity as state legislators to create the future you want to live in, to help build an education system that empowers every learner, supports every teacher, and strengthens every community. It's a privilege to stand shoulder to shoulder with so many of you in these efforts. And I can't wait as I watch what's happening across the country to see how far you go, how high you climb to create the enduring impact of those bold ambitions. Thank you.
Well, if that wasn't enough inspiration, we have a second speaker for you who, again, is going to do her best to inspire you to really think about the future of learning. Before I introduce her, I just wanted to point out something that's happening over here that you may not be able to see. We have a phenomenal graphic artist who is illustrating the conversation today. So it's going to be so neat to see what he puts up on that board and for us to be able to take a picture of it to really memorialize this opportunity that we've had to hear from these forward thinkers. So right now, I'm going to next introduce to you Okajoshi Hansen. She has worked in public education for over 25 years, most recently at Grantmakers for Education as the Chief Program Officer. So she's thinking a lot about what the future of learning can and should look like. She's a mom, she's an educator, and she thinks deeply about what her children need and the future that they're going into. Most recently, she's been an award-winning author of her book, The Future of Smart: How Education Systems Need to Change to Help All Young People Thrive. I've read this book. It inspired me. It spoke so clearly to the work that we were doing with NCEE that I thought it was a natural that we would include her in this conversation as well. If you haven't read it, we have a link to it on our app. And she also has a series of podcasts, too, where she talks about this. So I encourage you to check out those links. We also will have a link to the new framework that Vicki is about to release as well. And so if you go to that page, you can, that's the page where the framework will be posted, and you can sign up for a newsletter or an alert to let you know when it is posted. So with this, I'm going to welcome Oka to the stage and give her some time to share with you about her vision for the future of learning.
All right, good morning. Great to be here. It's great to go after Vicki, and I'm hoping that our two presentations together are going to help foster a really great dialogue afterwards. So if we can go to the first, I'm going to go to the first slide because that's what I do. I want to start with just a little bit about me. Right, our context, our stories matter so much in where we end up and how we see the world. So I'm a daughter of immigrants. My parents immigrated from Tanzania to the US. I was born in the US, but my parents, like many immigrants, didn't have a lot of social capital. I ended up being sent back to live with family in Tanzania, came back to school as an English language learner, grew up in New Jersey in a suburban community, but I spent a lot of my childhood traveling around the world, and that's something called a third culture kid. And so one of the lenses I bring is both having been educated in and doing a lot of work now in a lot of different systems. And so in some ways, my perspective is global. And my husband on the bottom right is a Colorado State Senator, and so I know a lot about your lives, and thank you for the work that you do, and also thank your families, because it's a sacrifice. But I think, I have a perspective on the really amazing opportunities and challenges that you all face at this moment, trying to bring together lots of complex pieces. And on the top right is just a picture of our family. Chris grew up in Kansas and Nebraska. I grew up all over the world. And that picture always reminds me of the United Benetton commercials from the late 90s. But that's the future of America, right? This family lives in Kansas, Nebraska, New Jersey, California, New York, Tennessee, and this is who we are building a future-facing education system for so that they can build a world that actually allows them to thrive. So that's just a little bit about me personally. In terms of my background, I am a teacher by training. Started teaching in Newark, New Jersey in the late 90s. Ended up working for a foundation after I left the classroom, and we funded very different kinds of schools. So we funded some of our first college preparatory charters. We also funded Montessori and Steiner schools. They were really different, and that question of what made them different is really what's driven my academic and my professional work. So I got my PhD in neuroscience and human development. I have a law degree, and my focus was on policy and all the systems that support education. And the through line of my career has been, what does it mean to create a human-centered education system? And when I started working 20 years ago, I used that term human-centered, and people would look at me, right? Isn't education human-centered? And I would say that 2023 brings that word, human-centered, into a new relevance for us, right? We've looked AI in the face, and I think what we're seeing is that it can do so much that we used to think was the domain of human beings, that we now have a question: what does it mean to be human? And part of that is, how do we educate our children? So one thing to know, I know you're legislators, so you're really good at looking like you're paying attention to me, but you're like thinking about lots of other things. I've got 12 minutes, and I'm gonna take us back in time, I'm gonna take us forward in time, and I'm gonna cover a lot of different topics. I will share the slides. If you walk away with a big picture, I'm here for the next couple of days and happy to talk further, but I thought about just giving you a piece of what I normally talk about. The problem is you all are so mired every day in the minutia that it's rare for you to get the opportunity to lift up and see the whole. And so I'm hoping to be able to contextualize what you're doing along with some ideas for you. And context matters. So 3 pieces of context about why we have to change education, some of which Vicki has already talked about. The first is this term VUCA. So the world right now is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And any one of those 4 words is not something that the human brain likes. When you put all 4 of them together, it's really hard. And part of the reason is this graph. It's technology. In 2017, when this graph was made, this is 2012, this is where we were. It felt like in 5 years we'd had so much technological change. This is where we're gonna be in 2042, and where we were then is here, and the second red line is where we are now. The takeaway from this is that the world is changing so fast that we have no way to predict what it is that young people are going to need in terms of skills, in terms of knowledge, because knowledge is changing, it's growing. The skills kids are gonna need are really different. And so when we think about what it is that young people need to thrive, you'll notice on here, the dominant piece is not academics. And it's not because academics and content don't matter, but they have to be the vehicles through which young people learn how to deal with ambiguity and to adapt, how to be interdependent and understand the ways in which we are connected to each other, understanding how to learn and what they need to learn new things, self-knowledge, understanding what they need to learn and have agency, being able to discern the world, being able to think about questions of values and ethics. We are long past the moment where we ask, can we do things? Now the question should be, if we do them, then what happens? To whom? And how do we do right, on the front end? So these things, I will point out, are not things you get by being lectured at about them. You get them by doing them. And so as we think about the future of education, I think we really have to be thinking about opportunities we give young people to be able to develop these skills. Second piece of context, human development. Strangely, our education system is not really aligned with what we know about human development. There is no way in which every 5 or 7 or 9-year-old is the same. That's not how we grow. And so what we know about human development, early childhood absolutely matters, but it's a time when our brains need to be growing in particular ways, that they grow through play-based, embodied, social learning. That develops the brain in ways that allow you to then grow and think critically, rationally. It's a time in these younger years where you're trying to connect ideas and understand the bigness of the world. And then adolescence, which runs from 12 to 25, incredibly under-understood. It rivals early childhood in terms of the brain development and rewiring that happens. It is a time when the brain opens back up, and a lot of things that may not have gone well early in life can be undone and redone. So it's an incredibly important period, and it's a period when young people are trying to understand who they are, who they want to be in the world, trying to understand how they connect and blend into the community. It's a time when young people are asking, who do I want to be in the world, and is there a place for me? And when we look at our statistics right now about youth well-being and mental health, I think a huge part of what we're seeing is that we are not allowing them what they need to develop in healthy ways. And a large part of that is identity formation. So we have to think about how education ties into that. And then the third piece of context is artificial intelligence. But I just want to put it in context. There was a long time ago a conversation about whether it should be called artificial intelligence or cybernetics. And the reason is because there are lots of different kinds of intelligence. There was mycelial intelligence, there's plant intelligence, there's animal intelligence, there's human intelligence, and now there is what we can call non-biological substrate intelligence. Artificial intelligence is built on non-carbon matter. It's not the same as a human brain. And so the question is, how can we be co-intelligent with artificial intelligence? Right? And there are certain human advantages that we have that we now need to be thinking about when we think about the future of education. So the top four are things that you kind of saw earlier. Metacognition, the ability to think through ethics, the ability to know what we're trying to do. The other piece is this other way of thinking about cognition. In schools, we tend to focus on our brains as the vector of thinking. But there is this term called the extended mind, and there are three other kinds of cognition: embodied, situated, and socially distributed. We think with and through our bodies. We think in the context that we're in, and our environments shape how we think. And we think differently when we think with other people. Right? And those different types of cognition, I think, are the things that are our comparative advantage that the future of education needs to be focusing on. So, pieces of context. A lot of my work is about going to schools and really understanding, kind of unpacking them to understand how they work. And in brief, I would say, regardless of governance model, public district, public charter, independent, private school, governance models to me are less important than the orientation that schools take to their work. There are some schools that are pretty conventional. They're sort of our modern day factory model education system from about 250 years ago. They focus generally on preparing kids for college, very driven by core academics, literacy, math, right? And they're not spending as much time on cognitive development. Very teacher-directed in their theories of learning, very driven by standardized summative and interim assessments, and they're doing social and emotional work, but they're not doing very rich work. It's more about managing young people than helping young people develop the skills to manage themselves. The second bucket in the middle, if this were actually proportional, is the biggest bucket. It's like 95% of what's out there. We recognize what doesn't work in conventional, and we bolt things on to try and make it better. Social emotional learning, project-based learning, culturally responsive practice, civics education, all these kinds of things. The problem is conventional education doesn't reflect what we know about human development or learning, and so there's so much to fix that you either cycle through interventions and you don't get what you want, or you try and do so much at the same time that it buckles under its own weight, and that is what we are hearing from educators in schools, is that they are exhausted. And then the third bucket is what I call human-centered liberatory. And those schools start at the bottom and they say, look, relationship to community is everything. Students and students, students and adults, students in the world. They're taking kids in and out. They're doing trauma-informed practice, but it's built into the design of the system itself. Multi-age classrooms, teachers looping. And then they're allowing kids to go out into the world and see the world, and it turns out what kids see is things they want to learn about and do something about. And so it focuses on interdisciplinary engagement and learning that is much more balanced across core, non-core, and cognitive skill development. I'll skip this, but during Q&A we can come back. But it's also very developmentally aligned. So how they think about relationship to community in elementary school is around kind of independence inside of relationships. For middle schoolers, it's about belonging. And for high schoolers, it's letting them talk about their identity, and that goes into college. And academically, the younger ones, it's how are ideas connected. In the middle school age, it's how are things relevant? Why should I care? And for high schoolers, it's who do I want to be in the world and how is my education relevant? And so these programs are much more student-directed in how they learn and teach. They allow kids lots of ways to show what they know, not just standardized tests. And they allow for lots of different pathways for kids to come out of high school and go into college. So I'm going to finish up with this. We know we have to change. The problem is, why is change so hard? So this is the philosophy part of my talk. Turns out there are two different ways we can understand the world. One way of understanding the world really helps us kind of understand the whole. It's complicated, it's a little bit kind of more nuanced. A second way of understanding the world is one where we try and simplify everything, put it into boxes, right, so that we can understand it. Both ways of understanding the world are important, but they have to be in balance. Interestingly enough, these two worldviews map over our brains. So this is not your right brain, you're artistic, your left brain, you're mathematical. It is our right hemisphere pays attention to the world in this big way. You're paying attention to a ton of stuff right now you're not even aware of. The left hemisphere simplifies things. And then when the brain is working properly, things should go back to the right to be used in context. The people who are doing this scientific research would argue, and I think they're right, that right now we're in a world that is very left hemispheric dominant. And when the left hemisphere dominates our ways of creating systems, it creates systems in that gray box that are very top-down, very mechanistic, very linear, very rigid, and they create different kinds of systems, whether you're thinking about the environment and climate, economics, education, healthcare. A second way of understanding the world is a more holistic indigenous way of understanding the world. And it allows us to create systems that serve human beings. And when we think about equity today, which for me is a lens I bring to all of this, I do not think you can get to equity by tinkering with the conventional ways of doing things. Inside their DNA are things that don't allow us to see, honor, and support the full diversity of humanity. And so we really need to be thinking about, and this is where education comes in, the first two buckets that I described are squarely in that gray circle. Human-centered liberatory sits in this blue circle. It is what kids need to thrive. It's what they need to thrive in the world today. It's the system we need to build for tomorrow. However, our current systems are not designed to support human-centered education. So when schools try and do something different, they're brought back through accountability, through grade levels, through all the structural pieces that we have in place. So I think for you as legislators, the question is, how can you at the state level hold two things in your mind at the same time? We have to improve our existing system for the kids in it. And we also need a new infrastructure for public education that is more ecological in nature and supports human-centered education. And the first phase of that work is where I think you have a lot of power, which is we need to create a new infrastructure, systems and structures that do what Vicki talked about. Allow us to say, how do you count learning if it's not in the classroom? How do you assess differently? How do you do accountability differently? How do you get kids into higher ed or post-secondary without just GPAs and AP tests? Right? You need to give room for people to actually answer those questions. So think of it as R&D. So if I were to give you the legislative angles on this, I would say there's a couple of phases. The first is carve out room in your states for research and development space where people who are already doing human-centered education, because there are, can opt into it. And then release them. The first part of policy is not new policies. It's release them from as many of the existing constraints as you can so that they have 3 to 5 years to begin building a new aligned policy system that supports human-centered education. Once you have that, right, you might have 5 different ways of doing accountability in your state, depending on whether you're rural or a native nation or an urban area. Once you have those solutions, then craft policy that allows those solutions to exist, right? So it's a different way of thinking about it. This is where I would say you as legislators in your states have the most power, and it's been interesting to talk and work with states that are trying to think about this both and approach, and have what you're doing that's future-facing inform the ways in which you improve education today. And really the possibility is this is what kids need to thrive. This is what allows us to actually support the full diversity of our young people and what they need. It's not countercultural, it's what we need, and I think you're standing at the forefront of being able to make it real for all of our kids. Thank you so much.
So now you can see why I come away from conversations with both of these wonderful colleagues so inspired, and inspired to do work with all of you and to shape the work that we do at NCSL differently, so that we aren't just thinking about how do we just keep fixing this plane while it's in the air, and instead thinking about building a new type of airplane. We've had so many different examples of where these sorts of opportunities are playing out. So my first question to both of you is that how do you get past the limited belief about what is possible? We have a wonderful colleague, Lou Jones, who I think is in the room, who often talks about how challenging it is when you don't know what's possible. When you're operating with the constraints of just what you see, and you don't know what's possible, what is out there in the world, what can we inspire to do in our own states that's finding success elsewhere. So my first question to both of you is, what would you suggest for legislators to help push themselves, to help push their colleagues, and even other state and local policymakers within their state to think past what they see right now and to think about the art of what's possible?
I mean, you could all go to Finland, but I actually think there are places in your communities that are already doing work differently. Go and see them. If you would like help finding them, email me. But like, there are places, and I think being able to go see schools and programs that are operating differently shows you what's possible. And I would say a lot of the schools I look at in that third bucket are not just affluent middle income communities. In fact, many of these schools and programs serve some of our most vulnerable and marginalized students. So I would say go see with your own eyes. I think that's always helpful. And Education Reimagined is a nonprofit. They have a series of videos that if you can't go see them, they actually go into schools and help you try and see it.
So I would echo that. One great thing is to go see. And if you can't go see, use something like what we're saying the best performing and most rapidly rising systems are doing, both in the US and globally, as just a springboard to conversation. I mean, make it clear that it is just a base knowledge that people should have. They should understand what best in class looks like out there, no matter where it is, and then they should think about what that looks like in their own context, in their own settings, and you can help them flex to do that. But, you know, great innovators understand the field and build on and springboard from what people are doing. And there are people in the US and around the world that are just great examples, from classroom up through full country systems to look at.
And I just have one more question for you. I know that as legislators, oftentimes what we hear is, I can't do this alone. I can't go back to the state and reimagine my education system by myself. So who would you suggest needs to be at the table? Who should they go back to their state and talk with? Who should be in that room when they're thinking about a new vision for education?
Go ahead. I did the last one. I think definitely it has to be a cross-section of people, right? I mean, part of what you have to do, I think, before you think about policy shift is to sort of engage the hearts and minds of many and start to get some of that common aspiration and shared ambition fomented, if you will. So that involves business leaders, community leaders, other civic and government leaders and elected officials. It also actually involves young people. So many times we actually do too, teachers or young people, rather than have them at the table as well. So getting that larger buy-in, and I think it's not one step at a time, it's doing a lot of these things simultaneously, and you are uniquely positioned in many ways to lead that conversation and kind of seize that moment.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you were going to create the R&D space, part of what these programs do is blur the line between health and human services, K-12, higher ed, and workforce. And so you need community advocates, you need people in pre-K, K-12, higher ed, policy, business, civic leaders. Cedar Rapids, Iowa was interesting. They went through a flood and they pulled together this kind of a coalition. They did a profile of a graduate exercise, here's what kids need, made everybody go to high school for 2 days and then brought them back and went out to see some schools, and that was the genesis of a whole new system in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So that kind of combines both.
Yeah. You can also create some opportunities for people to do things differently. If you can't get the whole state to move yet, create the kinds of things that many states are doing, like innovation zones or places where people have more flexibility and can actually try out some of these things and demonstrate what's possible.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time. We could go on all day with this discussion, but hopefully this has framed your thinking for the rest of the discussions that will be happening throughout the rest of the day. We have a very packed agenda today with education sessions, as you may have noticed, and then we have a couple others sprinkled throughout the rest of the week. So we hope that this has inspired you. Hopefully you'll be able to take away some nuggets from the other sessions to put this together with what you heard here. So help me thank our speakers once again. Our next education session is going to be just down the hall over lunch, and it's about lifelong learning accounts, and it's going to be in M109 and 110 at noon. We suggest you get your lunch early so you can come into the session and be sure to hear the full content. I know we're back and forth between this building and the other all day, so we will be sure to announce at the end of every session where our next session will be.